Hello everyone, so today we're going to talk about climate change and the Vax passport connection. So we want to talk about what's going on with climate change, the policy specifically, and its relation to what we see happening with the Vax mandates and the Vax passports. So there are important parallels that you want to keep in mind, and it's also important to remember that they have more in common than you think. And so the first thing we want to talk about is that both are painted as immoral or religious obligations. So what you may be hearing is that if you don't get the vax, you don't love your neighbor, or if you don't get the vax, you're not listening to God. And I spoke about that in one of my last videos with Governor Hochul. So there's this idea of the collective or the common good. So we all have to do a certain thing, for example, getting the vax, in order to, love the others around us. And we also can see those same arguments happening for climate change. So we see this happening, for example, in an article from the Jesuit Review, and it stated, think not only about your collective wallet, or not your collective wallet, your wallet, but your soul. So there's this idea of your soul salvation, or even blasphemy being connected to these policies in relation to vax mandates and climate change. So the second one that you want to keep in mind is that both use science and religion to get people on board with radical policies or radical political policies. So, for example, with the vax mandates, we see track and trace, exclusion from society based on injection status. We also see some QR codes coming in there. And so this is basically, it can store information on you, which includes some biometric data, first year vax status. And climate change will also incorporate many of these same things and some additional things. So for example, tracking your daily activities to determine your carbon emissions, and establishing punishments and rewards based on what you're doing. So for example, or your score. So basically it's like a social credit score system. And this actually exists in China. I'll probably post a link later. But we also can see in many ways that it's coming here. The third thing you want to keep in mind is that both claim to be helping the poor, but both are actually leading to the further people into poverty and destroying the middle class. So I did speak about this last year, how we see with the C-19 mandates, which are causing families in poor countries to essentially lose their wages, to lose their access to food. And we also see that lockdowns are leading to more children being at risk for child trafficking and more girls being at risk for childhood marriage. So we also see that vax mandates in many ways are doing something similar, because we see that small and medium-sized businesses have been destroyed. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later and how this happened. And also we're seeing millions are losing their jobs and access to commerce over these vax passports. So we see that there's a specific segment of society that is starting to lose their access to goods and services. And climate change will also have similar policies enacted, because we see that the same measures are being used, proposed. For example, lockdowns. We see that it hasn't worked before, but yet they're being proposed again to solve a crisis which would eventually lead to more crises. And we already see this happening with the shipping crisis, and we can be rest assured if we continue to use these same measures, we will see the same thing. Number 4, both will lead to totalitarianism and a removal of bodily sovereignty. So I've been speaking about the vax passports a lot, and we see that a system is being set up that if you attempt to opt out, your access to society will be removed. We can also see that, for example, actually I should explain how this works. Your passport can be set from active to expired by an unknown entity, whoever is running the system. And this person who controls the system basically controls your access to things. So they control your movements and essentially your life and where you can go. And this may occur because you haven't completed certain vax or other medical requirements that are levied on you by whoever. For example, this can be the state, it could be your employer, it could be whoever who has this authority. This may also happen if you're not in agreement with certain policies that the ruling class have, and if you make your thoughts known about this. For example, the Department of Homeland Security actually labeled over the summer, it was kind of a big deal, but they labeled those who are not in agreement with vaccine mandates as domestic terrorists. And it's important to remember that, unfortunately, with these labels, there comes certain consequences eventually if they decide to act on, their labels, how they chose to label certain groups in society. And so last year I also spoke about actual bills that are going through the Congress to establish quarantine camps for those who are deemed a public health threat. Some of you may have remembered that I spoke about Bill A-99, which was going through Congress and basically established these camps. And the CDC also has something called the Shielding Approach, and this essentially allows for those who are deemed high risk to essentially be removed and temporarily relocated to communities, camps, or wherever where they deem fit, where basically they will have limited access to their family members or limited contact with their family members and low-risk community members. So what is interesting to note is that in these bills and also on the website, which I can also post below, they mentioned that you cannot leave unless you consent to medical interventions. Sorry, just to clarify for that last statement, that specifically applies to the bills. That you cannot leave unless you consent to medical interventions prescribed to you and you're no longer deemed a threat. And so climate change is also integrated to this. For example, we have carbon taxes, and some may say that carbon taxes are essentially for businesses, but we have to remember that the cost will go back to the consumer. So for example, this can happen because the prices of goods and services will increase, and this will basically end up harming those in society who do not have the money to pay. And also, another issue with the climate change policies, and specifically, is tracking your activities and carbon emissions. So this will be a part of it, and punishments will be levied on those who do not comply. So the Vax passport system can be easily integrated into the climate change policies along with your biometric data and whatever else the entities in control choose to add. And the last thing that I'll mention is that the same ruling class that is behind these policies, so let me say that again. The same ruling class behind the Vax passport policies are the same people who are behind the climate change policies. So essentially, they're saying that they're doing it to benefit the poor, but they're actually exacerbating poverty. These policies are actually creating conditions that would make everyone equally poor and enrich those who are promoting the policies. So throughout the C-19 pandemic, policies were set in place that led to major wealth transfer. And this happened because small and medium-sized businesses were forced to close, while large businesses that were deemed essential remained open. For example, we had Walmart, we had Amazon, and this is not by accident that the wealthy billionaires became wealthier in 2020 because the money that would have been spent at small businesses and smaller shops went to bigger businesses and corporations. So the same groups and individuals that are pushing the vax mandates are also pushing climate change policies. And just to give you an example of a few, but of course there are more than what I mentioned, what I will mention are the Davos Group, Bill Gates, the World Economic Forum, which is kind of in combination with the Davos Group, and religious leaders as well, such as Pope Francis. And I wanted to read James 5, verses 1 through 6, because I think it's important to remember that, unfortunately, there is good and there is evil in this world. And it's important to remember that not all of our leaders, although there's some that are, unfortunately, some of our world leaders don't necessarily let's say, either act with the best intentions, or maybe they might, but unfortunately some of the actions that they take can be destructive. And I also want to clarify that this will talk about the rich, but we want to keep in mind that, of course, not all rich people are evil. There are, of course, good rich people. We read about them in the Bible. We see them in real life. But unfortunately, there are people who are wealthy who do take advantage of their wealth and use it to either manipulate people or to get what they want, and at the expense of others. And so this is what these verses are talking about. So we will be reading from James 5, verses 1 through 5. Go now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rest of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as if it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers, who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Ye have lived in pleasure on the earth, and have been wanton. Ye have nourished your hearts, as in the day of slaughter. Ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. So clearly we can see here that God has a stern warning against those who, again, use their wealth to manipulate things for their own purposes. And for the last thing I want to say is not just, the things that are happening, but what can we do now that we have certain information? And I think what we all need to do is start by informing ourselves and understanding the issues. You don't want to just get behind policies because it sounds like a good idea, or your friends are doing it, or any of those things. You really want to understand, okay, what are these policies? Where are they headed? Because if you don't, you might end up going somewhere where you would not have normally intended. And it's important that we talk to those around us about what's happening, because sometimes, things are happening, but people really don't know that these are happening. And of course, we have mainstream media, but unfortunately with mainstream media, they often concentrate on other things, but leave out other things that are very important. So it is up to all of us to make sure that we understand everything that's happening and understand how these policies are connected, that they're not happening necessarily in isolation, but all of them actually do work together. And of course, I spoke last year about how world leaders connected these policies, the C-19 policies, to climate change. So this is not necessarily new. This has been happening for a while, and it's important that we know and we're aware and stay informed. And also try to get into groups and share with others about where these policies are headed. It's important that we remember that being pro-vax, and I'm not a fan of the pro-vax versus anti-vax debate for many reasons, but I think it's important to remember that pro-vax doesn't necessarily mean pro-vax mandates, because they're two different things, and pro-vax passports, again, it's a completely different thing. So you can be pro-vax, but you don't necessarily have to be pro-forced pressure and coercion. So I'll end by discussing a little bit about stewardship over our body and over the environment. So this video is not to say that climate change and C-19 are not issues. They are. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with the mandates and where all of this is headed. There are other ways to deal with it. Of course, I've talked extensively about C-19 and early treatment options that other doctors are talking about, and I'll probably post more about that at the end of the video and some of the links. But it's important for us to, instead of force people to do what we want them to do, to lead by example and understand that some people will agree and some people won't, and that is okay. But we have to remember that God does value freedom of choice. As much as we don't agree, we cannot necessarily force people to do what we think is the right thing. And remember when we were speaking with each other, this proverb, so this comes from Proverbs 15, verse 1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. So, of course, when you're speaking to people, it's not just about what you're saying, but also the tone, the way you're looking at them. Everything goes into that, your body language when speaking, whether you're being defensive or not. So yes, you may be very well correct on your viewpoint, but at the same time, you have to also remember that you're speaking with humans, right? So yeah, I also believe in, taking care of the environment, but again, I don't believe in using force, pressure, and coercion to do that. I do believe in, doing positive things and allowing people to, follow as they feel led. But that'll be it for this video. Perhaps another video I'll talk about additional things that I think that can be done to better take care of our environment, of course, our own bodies. But yeah, that'll be it for now, and I'll see you in the next video.